Thank you. Thank you. So our next speaker is Akshay Gupta, and the title of his talk is Can the Bhagavad Gita? Can the Bhagavad Gita explain the existence of consciousness? Is a question.
Thank you. So I'll share my screen. Okay. Can you all see that? And can you all hear me okay? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so the title of my talk is Can the Bhagavad Gita explain the existence of consciousness? And specifically, I have phenomenal consciousness in mind. That's the consciousness associated with us having a felt quality of our experiences. And so, right, so I'll start by introducing the Bhagavad Gita's theory of consciousness. There's many interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita, so in this presentation, I specifically have a Vaishnava interpretation of the Gita in mind. According to this interpretation of the Gita, Krishna is the supreme God. He's all-powerful, all-knowing, all good. Also, according to this interpretation of the Gita, the highest yoga path described in the Gita is the path of Bhakti Yoga, or the path of devotion. Also, according to this theory of consciousness, selves are immaterial substances. The Bhagavad Gita says that the self is indestructible, unborn, and unchanging. The Gita also says that the self has consciousness, and it's through the self's, basically the self's consciousness pervades the body. The Gita, like other Indic traditions, including Sankhya, also describes the existence of a subtle body. This has three components. This has the mind, or the manas, and this mind is different than the Cartesian mind. It has intelligence, or buddhi, which is like a type of power we have to discern between things. And it has ego, or ahankara, which is what's responsible for causing us to identify with the physical body. Notably, according to the Gita, these aspects of the subtle body, they're not maybe physical in the sense that they're not describable or known by the laws of physics, but they are a type of material element. They're a part of Prakriti. Prakriti is has many meanings. It can mean like the world. In one sense, it's like the substratum of the world. It's also a type of stuff. And these elements, they're subtle, but they're still considered to be part of this Prakriti. So because the Gita talks about immaterial substances, this raises the question of whether or not the Gita's theory of consciousness is a type of substance dualism, where substance dualism is a view associated with Descartes. So although the Gita has certain similarities with substance dualism, I think it's problematic to claim that the Gita is a type of substance dualism, or at least similar to Cartesian substance dualism. So in Cartesian substance dualism, the mind is immaterial and the bearer of consciousness. In contrast, the Gita draws a distinction between the mind and the self. So according to the Gita, the mind is material, whereas the self is non-material, immaterial, and is the bearer of consciousness. In Cartesian dualism, there's basically just two things. There's the immaterial mind and there's the physical body. The Gita has three things related to the self and consciousness. It has the physical body, but it also has the subtle body I mentioned earlier, and then there's also the self. Moreover, according to the Gita, it describes that the elements of the subtle body and selves are considered a Prakriti of Krishna. And Prakriti has many meanings, but one way that it's been interpreted is that for matter, the subtle body and selves to be a Prakriti of Krishna means that they ontologically depend on Krishna. You can maybe say that they're a part of Krishna in a certain sense. And so because matter, subtle body, and selves have a common ontological foundation, namely Krishna, there's a certain unity to them. So in one sense, they're not wholly distinct, or they're not completely distinct, whereas Cartesian substance dualism treats mind and the body to be much more, you can say, radically distinct. So with that in mind, The Gita, because it does posit the existence of immaterial substances, of immaterial selves, it's susceptible to similar objections as Cartesian dualism. So one of the main objections to Cartesian dualism is the famous interaction problem. And this is basically the question of how an immaterial self or an immaterial mind can interact with the physical body if they're two very different types of things. And so there's different formulations of the interaction problem. One formulation just says that radically different things can't interact. This is maybe a more naive version of the interaction problem. And yeah, it says that because selves and physical things are so wholly distinct from each other, they simply can't interact. The typical response given to this by ordinary Cartesian substance dualists is just sort of a why think this type of response. Just because two things are different, it doesn't necessarily entail that they can't interact. Some more work might be needed to show that this type of interaction is impossible. The Gita can inform a second response to this objection. This response says that selves and matter are not wholly distinct in a really strong way. They have a certain unity because they share a similar ontological foundation. So you might think that they have enough similarity to each other in virtue of this common ontological foundation to interact with each other. There's another formulation of the interaction problem. This is perhaps the stronger formulation of it. And this formulation says that physics is causally closed. There's the principle of the causal closure of the physical. And so according to this principle, it states that everything that exists is describable in the language of physics. However, immaterial substances, they're not describable in the language of physics. So if this causal closure of the physical is true, then there's no room for immaterial substances to interact with matter or causally influence things in the world. And one response to this objection is that it involves a certain degree of circular reasoning, or it can be if things aren't spelled out so clearly. So the causal closure of the physical, our main justification for it is basically a type of inductive inference. We see that we look at the world and we see that there's different physical events. And as we see different physical events in the world, we see that they have physical causes. So we might imply that all physical events have physical causes. The problem with drawing this inference or concluding that this principle is true in all cases is that still as of now, we don't know what happens in the case of mind-body interaction. And that's important because if mind-body interaction is something non-physical, then we can't support this principle of the causal closure of the physical. So in order to justify the causal closure of the physical, one has to look at mind-body interaction and basically suppose that it's physical. That's the only way you can draw this strong claim that everything, that physics is causally closed. And so if it's simply assumed that mind-body interaction is physical, then that's not really giving an argument for the causal closure of the physical. It's basically assuming it, and that's a type of circular reasoning. Then there's a third formulation of the interaction problem. This is the pairing problem. And basically this problem says, why does a certain self, you can call this self S1, interact with a body B1 instead of a body B2? And likewise, why does a self S2 interact with a body B2 instead of B1? It seems that there has to be some relevant difference or differences between S1 and S2 that explains each respective self's self-body pairing. Yet, as proponents of the pairing problem argue, there seem to be no relevant differences between two selves, which could account for the difference that could account for why each one has the self-body pairing that it has. But if there's no such differences that could explain each self-body pairing, it seems that self-body interaction should not be possible. So there's certain assumptions that the pairing problem has. The pairing problem specifically requires the following claim. If S1 and S2 share all their properties except for bare numerical identity, then S1 is no more qualified to count as the cause of something X rather than S2 is. And so there's a response to this objection that one can make drawing on the Bhagavad Gita. And this is that according to a Vaishnava interpretation of the Gita, and also within the broader Vaishnava tradition, each self is its own distinct personality with various differences. And so it's not that all selves are sort of qualitatively identical. Each self will have their own distinct properties apart from bare numerical identity due to their different personality or features of their intrinsic self. And so one might argue that these differences are relevant differences between selves and could explain self-body pairing. Another response, which is also open to proponents of Cartesian substance dualism, is that God pairs selves and bodies together, and so that accounts for the different links between them. Finally, there's a fourth formulation of the interaction problem, and this formulation is that we might argue that the lack of identification of a causal mechanism between selves and the body makes the Gita's theory of consciousness less plausible than competing views. So earlier I argued that one response to the interaction problem is just to say, so what? Here, a proponent of the interaction problem might press the dualist further and say that if we don't have some mechanism to explain self-body interaction, then the other views on offer to explain consciousness are just as good, if not better, than what the substance dualist or the proponent of the Gita is providing. So one response which can be informed by the Gita is that God gives or sustains causal powers in selves, and through these causal powers, selves can interact with their specific bodies. And so the Gita does give some motivation for thinking that some view like this is correct. Specifically, Bhagavad Gita 13:22 states, in this body is the Supreme Person, who is also said to be the highest self. This highest self is the overseer, permitter, master, enjoyer, and great Lord. And here specifically, I draw attention to the word permitter. The Sanskrit for this is anumanta. And the idea that Krishna permits selves interaction with their body suggests that Krishna is involved with self-body interaction in some way. This could support the reading that Krishna endows selves with causal powers through which they can interact with their body, so there is some scriptural support for my claim. Of course, one can raise various objections to this response. One might argue that the idea of God giving selves causal powers is just ad hoc and unmotivated. And so in response, I note that the Gita and this verse in particular were written far before the interaction problem was well known. There's just some scholarly debate about exactly when the Gita was composed. The tradition says it's quite old, but even modern scholars would say that it's hard to motivate a date later than 500 CE, and that's still far before the interaction problem was really widely spread. So it's hard to claim that this is simply an ad hoc attempt to explain interactions between selves and bodies. A second objection is that appealing to God to explain self-body interaction seems to unnecessarily bring God into the picture. It seems that God has become this metaphysical prop that one introduces to try to explain this interaction. And so one response is that someone who adheres to the Gita or a theist might have independent reasons for believing in God apart from trying to explain self-body interaction. For instance, they might have certain spiritual or religious experiences, or they might arrive at belief in God through natural theology or something along those lines. There's a third objection, and this is one based on parsimony. This says that a worldview that includes God and souls is less simple than other worldviews. And so scientists and also metaphysicians generally value the value of simplicity or parsimony. They generally say that all else being equal, we should prefer simpler worldviews over less simple worldviews. However, simplicity is not everything. Some people argue that simplicity is just a tiebreaker, but in any case, most views on simplicity say that if a view has greater explanatory power, this can offset the loss of simplicity it might have. So if one has stronger reasons to accept God and souls, such as spiritual experiences or arguments for a soul, then a worldview with God and souls can have more explanatory power, and that can offset the added loss of simplicity it has by including God and souls. A fourth objection is that if God is the one giving selves causal powers, then this seems to suggest that selves are basically causally inert and lack any type of causal powers without God's involvement. One might argue that this is a problem. One response to this is just to sort of shrug it off and say that it's not that big of a bullet to bite. One might argue that the idea that God gives selves causal powers actually upholds God's sovereignty, and that's something that's valued by theists, including those that adhere to the Gītā. There's a second response also that's open to proponents of the Gītā. This response is that it's not necessarily the case that selves are causally inert without God. It's possible that even if God didn't actively sustain causal powers in selves, they might have a certain power to interact with matter due to sharing the same foundation as matter, namely God. So far I discussed the interaction problem, but there's also another problem that proponents of the Gītā are tasked with addressing. And this has to do with an objection that Brendan Rickabaugh and J.P. Moreland raise in their latest book on consciousness. So they object to any theory of consciousness that posits a spatially extended, spatially continuous soul. And specifically, they argue that such a theory of consciousness cannot account for the unity of consciousness. And so the Gītā's view does, or at least the broader Vaishnava tradition posits that selves are spatially extended in some type of way. Selves have a non-material form. And on account of this non-material form, that seems to suggest that there's some type of spatial extension or something along those lines going on. In contrast, the view that Rickabaugh and Moreland prefer say that souls are kind of like a point-like particle, and so the Gītā disagrees with that view. So they give a more formal definition to the unity of consciousness. They say that there's a unity of consciousness when an individual can have a conscious state C that includes other phenomenal states P1 and P2, and there's something it is like to be in both states at once. So I believe their example was something like if you're on the beach and you might have two phenomenal states at once. You might see the sunset and you might also feel a cool ocean breeze. So because our consciousness is unified, there's a certain conscious state that includes each of these individual phenomenal states, and there's something it's like to experience both states at once. And so one point also about the Gītā's view of the soul or the self is that while it says that selves are immaterial and have, maybe you can say, a spiritual body, it would still say that selves are mereologically simple in the sense that they are not composed of parts. They might be extended simples in common or modern philosophical terminology. And so to motivate their objection, Moreland and Rickabaugh say a little bit more about this objection. So they say, consider a movie screen and take it to be spatially extended, yet uncomposed. In this case, its surface is a primitive unit of two-dimensional extension. That surface may not be composed of a diversity of non-identical parts, but it does, in fact, contain several non-identical regions. This becomes evident if we divide the screen arbitrarily into a set of non-overlapping square-foot regions that, taken collectively, overlap and only overlap with the entire surface. When a movie is projected onto the screen, there is no region that overlaps with the entire movie. Instead, the entire movie is distributed such that each region of the screen overlaps with only one aspect of what is shown on the entire screen. Analogously, if a spatially extended, spatially continuous soul is postulated to explain the unity of consciousness, it will fail to do so. Each subreason of the extended soul will overlap with and only with one aspect of one's totalizing state of consciousness. Only an unextended simple avoids this problem. So Rickabaugh and Moreland's objection can be summarized like this. So if each region of a spatially extended self or soul must overlap with one aspect of one's consciousness, each region of a spatially extended self must overlap with one aspect of one's consciousness. In this case, one would expect there to be a combination of different disparate aspects of consciousness that are not unified. In response to this type of argument, one can first ask, why think that this is the case? Their argument depends on there being a close analogy between selves consciousness and the projection of a movie onto a screen. But it seems dubious that this analogy really holds. Those two things are very different, so it's sort of doubtful whether or not this argument succeeds if it depends on this particular analogy. There's one way to reply to this response and another way to motivate this objection. So one might say that if there's an extended self, then the different regions of this extended self would be parts, and then consciousness would have to be distributed among these parts. And if consciousness is distributed among its parts, it seems that consciousness wouldn't really be unified, but there'd just be different disparate aspects of consciousness distributed amongst each part. And so I have a counter reply to this reply, and that is that the parts of, an especially extended self with a non-material form and a type of spiritual body, it may have different spatial regions. You might be able to divide this form up into distinct regions. And you might consider these parts in one sense, but these regions are not parts in an important sense. These regions are not parts in the sense that they do not constitute a whole. So in that case, because these regions are not really parts in that sense, a self's consciousness does not need to be distributed amongst its parts. Rather, one can maintain that consciousness is simply a property of a simple immaterial self. And one can also state that there's a unity of consciousness because there's only one bearer of consciousness. Notably, Moreland and Rickabaugh, when trying to explain the unity of consciousness, also make a similar point. They argue that there's a unity of consciousness because we're simple individuals, so they also account for the unity of consciousness by appealing to a single bearer of consciousness. However, if they're appealing to the simplicity of the self in order to explain the unity of consciousness, it seems that that move is also available to the Gītā, and so that's one reason to be doubtful of Moreland and Rickabaugh's objection. Still, there might be another objection they might raise, and that objection is if consciousness is not distributed amongst the parts of the bearer of consciousness, as I've claimed, then it seems that physicalists would have no problem in explaining the unity of consciousness. This is because physicalists can maintain that consciousness is unified because it's the property of the mind or the brain. My response is that if physicalism is true, then the bearer of consciousness is very likely the brain. However, the brain is a composite object composed of parts in the sense that the parts actually constitute this object. And so since the brain is a composite object in this way, consciousness has to be explained by its parts. Otherwise, they would be brute emergence. And there's two types of emergence that philosophers talk about. There's weak emergence, where a certain emergent property is intelligibly explained by the things that sort of make up the thing that make up the new thing. So, for example, when there's hydrogen and oxygen, individually they're not liquid at room temperature, but when you combine them, they make H2O, and H2O has the property of liquidity, or at least at room temperature. And so this property of liquidity is something that emerges. It's not in either hydrogen or oxygen, but when they're combined together, it sort of comes out. This is generally considered a case of weak emergence because it's the liquidity is intelligibly explained. If you know the chemical structure of hydrogen, oxygen, and the bond between them, you can have some account for why this liquidity is there. However, with consciousness, it's the type of emergence that is there with consciousness is generally taken to be a type of brute emergence, unless you say that consciousness is somehow fundamental to matter. And so physicalists who try to explain the unity of consciousness by appealing to the brain, if they don't say that consciousness is somehow fundamental to matter, then they're basically going to accept a type of brute emergence, and that's problematic. However, proponents of a simple self are not committed to brute emergence. That's because selves are not composite objects, and so consciousness can be explained as a property of the self without raising the charge of brute emergence. And so now I can open it up to questions.
So, questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting paper. Do you hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear you, yeah.
I just have a question concerning the interaction of mind and body as you presented it displayed in the Gītā. Would you say it's some kind of somehow God has to well assist all things all the time?
Yeah, you got cut out a little bit, but did you ask if the Gita talks about a type of occasionalism?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's actually three interpretations of the Gita, the verse I mentioned. One interpretation could be a type of occasionalism where every instance of self-body interaction is basically due to God's will directly. I think there's another interpretation, I didn't discuss it, but you could say that God upholds certain psychophysical laws, and it's on account of those laws that selves can interact with their body. I think there's a third option also, which is that God sustains causal powers in selves, and so God gives selves the causal powers, but after souls or selves have these causal powers, it's not that God needs to personally supervise and manage each and every single instance of of self-body interaction. You might say that God is the permitter in the sense that he sustains these powers, but he's not like actively moving matter in response to a self's will at each and every instance. So I don't think you could read that verse as describing a type of occasionalism, but I think there's another way to interpret it as well.
Very good. Someone.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering what you do to account for consciousness in nature. Does this account you've made land you with the problem of only saying that humans are conscious?
Yeah, so the Gita's view would be that any like the soul or self is not limited just to humans. So animals would also have a self. Depending on your views, you might say that certain types of like plants might have selves as well. So the Gita's view is that the self is sort of everywhere. It's not that, selves can be embodied in different forms according to their different karmic merits and demerits. According to one specific embodiment or form of embodiment, that consciousness might not be manifested to the fullest degree, but many forms of life would have consciousness to some degree because of the self. Yeah, I see a hand on the screen. Rajeshwari?
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Gupta. Thank you for the presentation. I am doing research on consciousness, but on the applications of consciousness for the purpose of education, emotional well-being, and also for employment in the sense for work, which would translate to karma yoga. So are you doing any work, like, for example, there are concepts like nishkam karma and shakam karma from Gita.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing any work on how consciousness or higher consciousness in being applied towards work that gives emotional well-being, spiritual fulfillment, and also creates material wealth, something along that line?
Yeah, I'm not actively researching that, but I've taught on the Bhagavad Gita, and when I teach that, I cover karma yoga and discuss the notion of how, I guess, purifying one's consciousness or purifying one's desires can enable one to achieve peace, or how managing one's desires can enable one to achieve peace. So I guess I'm familiar with that type of line of reasoning. I just haven't actively researched it.
You have a
I heard a voice and then it got muted.
I had to mute it because otherwise there's an interference with the sound, but there's a question for you now.
Okay, quick question. what it's like to be consciousness. So but in the rest of the talk, you perhaps, I think you didn't mention that. So my question, why? And second, why you are taking this specific sense of consciousness? You think the Gita doesn't take into account consciousness in other sense, like a functional sense of consciousness, for instance?
Yeah, part of what your response got cut out. So before responding, you're basically asking why I focus on phenomenal consciousness specifically.
Yes.
Okay. I think the Gita can explain consciousness in maybe other types, but the reason I focus on phenomenal consciousness is because I guess there's the hard problem of consciousness, and it's one of the main areas of philosophy of mind to specifically explain phenomenal consciousness. So I focus on it not because it's the only type of consciousness the Gita can explain, but because that's the one that there's a lot of debate around. And so I see the Gita's view as a competitor to some of the other options on offer, like identity theory or property dualism or panpsychism. So I wanted to highlight the specific, I guess, ways that the Gita can resist some objections that have been raised against substance dualism to kind of show how it's a viable competitor to these other theories that are widely discussed in philosophy of mind.
I have a question online.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that the unity of consciousness for a single self. I was just curious about your view about what Gita's view is regarding unity of consciousness, not just for the self, but overall unity of consciousness. Do you feel that Gita promotes the view that there are individual consciousness for each individual self, or just like, the Advaita philosophy's view of consciousness, that there's only one consciousness overall?
Yeah, thank you for that. So there's much debate about this point. And so I basically focused on a Vaishnava interpretation of the Gita to sort of restrict the focus. And I think a Vaishnava interpretation of the Gita is more clear in that each self is sort of its own distinct individual, and there's no sort of unified consciousness. The Advaita view, depending on how you see it, might treat consciousness as more unified. I've just chosen to focus on a Vaishnava interpretation in this PowerPoint, and according to a Vaishnava interpretation, it would deny that there's a oneness of consciousness in the Advaitic sense.
But you do agree that in some sense there is unity of the consciousness through the concept of God.
Yeah,
so each self is an extension of God, and God provides that unity of consciousness.
Can I just ask you not to unmute yourself and ask questions, because there's a process here of asking questions. So you may answer the question, but for the next questions, please do not unmute yourself and ask a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. A Vaishnava interpretation, that's a good point, that there would be a certain unity in the sense that each self is sort of one with other selves in the sense that they share a common ontological foundation. So there's different Vaishnava traditions that talk about the relationship between selves and God as one and different, or beta. So I think that's a plausible way to read the Gita, that each self has their own distinct individuality and personality. At the same time, there's a oneness because they share a common ontological foundation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there's a question in the room.
Yeah. So you might ask your question again. Yes, please.
So my question is, when you mentioned that consciousness must be in some sort of space, if I recall correctly, how to define space and consciousness in their relationship? Space is material or immaterial, and equally consciousness as material or immaterial.
Yeah, that's a great question. On this point, I have to admit, this is where there's maybe a certain element of mystery about the nature of the self that I haven't quite grasped. But the Gita's, different Vaishnava traditions do say that the self is some type of body, which suggests some type of like extension. it's possible. Well, one view is that I know in the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, there's the view that selves sort of exist in a different realm, and when they're in this world, it's not that the self sort of is in this world, it's that the self is like somehow connected to bodies, almost like if it's almost like a video game simulation where if someone is like in a room on their couch playing like a video game, they're moving the character, they're kind of identifying with the character, they're causing the character to move through their actions, but the actual person is not like where the video game is. So some traditions have this maybe simulation view of things where the self is extended and it lives in its own realm, but it remotely interacts with the body through some means. I suppose you could also say that like selves are extended, but they're not extended maybe in the same dimension as material things. You might be able to maybe make that type of move. But yeah, it's something I haven't really fully grasped. I think more work could be done to understand exactly what it means for a self to be extended or to have form. But I would take that it's not a extension in like material or physical space, maybe in another dimension or from a remote distance.
Thanks. Some more question? All right, so let's thank Akshay Gupta.
There is one more.
There's a more.
There is one more online. I'm just going to unmute this chap. Just 1 second.
Yes.
Where is
Okay,
he?
the last question then.
Where is he? Hold on. It disappeared. Here. Unmute. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear. Thank you. So,
Oliver. Oliver
Chelon,
Chiron.
yes, Dr. Oliver Chelon,
Can you
yes.
speak now?
How interdynamic consciousness can be cut out into different parts. Consciousness is God, because God is a form of unity, like Gītā. Just a question, not very powerful in this matter. But...
So could you repeat the question? I'm not sure if I got that.
How interdynamic consciousness can be cut out into different parts if consciousness is God, because God is a form of unity. So
Okay. Yeah, so the Gita's view is that I guess consciousness is fundamental. So it's God has consciousness and his consciousness is just fundamental. It doesn't sort of arise at any stage. And similarly with selves, also consciousness is fundamental. So it's not that consciousness, the Gita's view, as I read it, is not that consciousness it's not that self's consciousness breaks off from a larger consciousness. Each self just has consciousness as a fundamental intrinsic aspect of it. And so any living being has consciousness fundamentally. So God has consciousness, although God's consciousness is presumably far more advanced than ours. And we have consciousness. And each living being just has it as a fundamental property.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Akshay. So this was the last talk. So our conference is reaching an end.